Saudi Arabia is all set to host Ukraine peace talks in Jeddah next month, with an aim to find a way to start negotiations over Russia's war on Ukraine. According to the reports, a total of 30 countries will be taking part in the summit, including India, Brazil and South Africa. Planning for the event is being overseen by Kiev. However, Russia is not expected to attend the summit. The question being, if Saudi Arabia will be able to broker peace between Russia and Ukraine. To talk more on this, we have with us Glenn Dessen. He's a professor of international relations and he's joining us live from Norway. Thank you so much for joining us on WION, Mr. Dessen.
Oh, my pleasure.
Right. Now, Professor, this is not the first time that a country is trying to negotiate or mediate peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. Earlier, we had seen how Turkey was also trying to bring the warring sides on the negotiating table. But my question to you is that what makes Saudi Arabia exceptional? Why do you think Saudi Arabia will be able to broker peace talks between both the countries?
Well, I don't think they will be able to broker peace. And I think this is very different than what the Israelis and Turkey attempted to do, because they attempted to broker peace between Ukraine and Russia. Now, this resembles more like the so-called peace summit we had last month in Denmark, in which Russia wasn't invited. And I think that this follows the same plot, which is it can hardly be called a peace summit or brokering peace when the opposing side, which is Russia, has not been invited to participate. So I don't see it as a peace negotiation. I think they stated very clearly they're seeking to push for an agreement which favors Ukraine. So the purpose of the meeting is therefore for NATO to mobilize support in the global south for the proxy war. And also, I think, to sow divisions, obviously, between Russia and other BRICS countries. So call it an effort to end the neutrality of the global south and expand the anti-Russian alliance.
Absolutely. I was just coming to that. Russia has not been invited for the upcoming summit. Rather, the upcoming summit is a successor to a similar meeting which took place in Copenhagen last month, like you mentioned, where countries from South America, Africa and Southeast Asia will be asked to back Ukraine's peace plan in the upcoming summit in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and well, there's obviously a desperate need for peace negotiations to end this horrible war. But we also seen consistently this lack of interest in negotiations. Keep in mind that the day after Russia invaded in February of 2022, the US State Department made it clear it was not prepared for negotiations. The month after, it even made it clear and reiterating that this conflict was bigger than Ukraine, implying that even if Ukraine would negotiate, the US would not be supported. And as you mentioned, first the Israelis attempted to negotiate, and what the Israelis confirmed was they were close to an agreement in which Ukraine would accept it would not join NATO and Russia would pull out. But as the Israelis suggested, the US blocked it, as they didn't want it. And then Turkey attempted to negotiate as well, to broker a deal, and they reported the same thing, that someone in the West, mainly the United States, did not want peace negotiations. So even though they were close to an agreement, the US blocked it. And we also learned that Boris Johnson went to Kyiv and promised all the weapons in the world from NATO if Ukraine refused to negotiate. And I guess last was earlier this year when China put forward a proposal for ceasefire and actual negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. And again, at this point, the US rejected it immediately without any discussion, saying that any ceasefire now would be unacceptable. That was their word. So I think that I would be skeptical of this summit, because I think in NATO we seek to defeat Russia. So there hasn't been any sign of actual seeking or accepting to negotiate. By definition, where we actually sit down with Russia and addresses the security concerns of both sides. So I see this more as a power game.
Absolutely, Professor. It seems like there are too many peace plans on the table right now. On one hand, the US, EU and other Western countries have endorsed Zelensky's peace plan, while on the other hand, Putin says that African and Chinese initiatives could be the basis for ending the ongoing war.
Yeah, well, again, one has to look at the peace plan. It doesn't seem like much of a peace plan. It seems more like calling for the defeat of or capitulation of Russia, because what the peace plan suggests is Russia pulls out completely out of Ukraine, but in return, Russia gets nothing. This peace plan does not address Russia's security concern of NATO expansionism, which triggered this war. So again, this peace plan, it feels, same as this peace summit, it feels to some extent like Orwellian doublespeak, because what it will put forward is essentially a way of escalating the conflict and bring more misery. I think what's really needed is for countries like India or China to actually broker a peace. I don't see NATO being capable of doing it, because I think we are very deeply a part of this conflict as well.
Right, Professor, you mentioned China. In your viewpoint, do you think China will be able to broker peace between Russia and Ukraine? Because earlier we saw how it acted as a peace mediator between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Yes, but I don't think the West would never accept China to broker a peace, especially the United States. I think, again, I think the ideal country would actually be a huge country which gets along properly with all sides, which would be a country like India, simply because the United States would even be forced to at least pretend it would consider negotiations in order not to alienate the Indians. But China, given the tensions with the United States, I think they've rejected China altogether as a negotiator.
Right.
So it's again, when China put this proposal forward, the Ukrainians indicated interest in this, but it was the Americans who shut it down. So time and time again, I think the main obstruction to any negotiations and ceasefire is always Washington. So for that reason, I think that India would probably be a much better candidate than China, simply because of the more favorable relations it has with Washington.
Absolutely. Just to add to that, China's 12-point peace plan also did not fare well, which Xi Jinping introduced a few months ago. But in the latest, Putin has said that Russia is ready to hold peace talks with Ukraine. Do you think that will be a success, or do you see that happening anytime soon?
Russia, when they first went into Ukraine, they went in with less than 200,000 men. This is, despite the narrative, this is not enough to conquer Ukraine or annex the country or restore the Soviet Union or any of these stories. I think the objective was to impose its conditions and resolve the conflict, because as we've also learned, after the West toppled the government in Ukraine, the Minsk II agreement became the main format for solving this conflict. But as we learned from both the French and the Germans who negotiated this, they had no intentions of implementing it. This was, in their words, an effort to buy time to arm and train the Ukrainian army, which suggests that the military solution was always intended. So I simply don't see it going anywhere. But when Russia invaded, from almost day one, they were trying to push for negotiations, and the Ukrainians wanted it. So
right.
This war could have been over within the first week if they would have been allowed to.
Right, Professor, my last question to you. Just help me understand that why Saudi Arabia holding the upcoming summit, which clearly favors Ukraine, understanding how Saudi Arabia also has a close relationship with Russia as a part of the OPEC Plus group.
Yeah, that's strange indeed. I can't really answer that, because I don't have any eyes into the Saudi state. I'm not sure. They might have an interest in playing a large diplomatic role. They might have to, much like Turkey, who said that they're neutral, they have to signal that they're also not aligning too closely with Russia. So they have to show they're balancing perhaps with the United States, that they're also leaning towards them. The US could simply pressure them to take this position. It would be, from my point, mere speculations, as I would know.
Right, right. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us on WION and sharing your insights with us on this story. Of course, we're tracking this very closely right here. Thanks very much.